Rabbi, we're on DAF Mem Tes Amid Aleph. We're on the fourth line of the Gemara. Now, Perek HaNizakin, according to Tosfos, it really has nothing to do with the laws of GITTEN. And the whole reason why it's introduced here in the middle of Maseches GITTEN is because it's continuing along with the theme of what we call Tikkun HaOlam. Now, the term Tikkun Olam in the non-Orthodox world has taken on a much larger meaning than it was originally meant when we look at the Mishnah. The term Tikkun HaOlam in the Mishnah simply means that there are specific provisions made on a societal level within the Jewish community in order to either preserve the economics or the well-being of the Jewish community. And that's really a theme that we had seen previously in the previous parak, and it had related to GITTEN as well. But now we're talking about issues that have to do with Tikkun Olam that are not related to GITTEN at all, but at least now we know the connection to Maseches GITTEN. The Mishnah had told us that when a person, there are three levels of real estate that a debtor has to pay when he owes someone money. The three levels are, Idis is the highest level, Beinonus is the middle level, and Ziboris is the lowest level. And when a person is obligated to pay off a debt, he would prefer to pay with Ziboris, because even though quantitatively he's paying back the same dollar amount, but a person would prefer to pay off property with junk real estate than with prime real estate, because prime real estate is more sellable. However, a creditor, someone who is owed the money, would rather collect money from Idis, because that's the most sellable it's the most desirable form of real estate, even though he's getting a smaller piece. Now, when it comes, the Mishnah told us that when it comes to people who are owed money because of damages inflicted upon them by the debtor, so the halacha is that the person is entitled to Idis, the damaged party is entitled to Idis. Now, that actually is based on Torah law, because the Torah says, Ki aver ish sadeh ocherem, that if a person burns down his friend's field, meitav sadehu, then the injured party gets to be compensated by the best of the field of the injuring party. The next category is when there is a loan that is made. A loan. So in cases of loans, the creditor gets to collect the debt from Beinonus, from average real estate. When it comes to a woman's ksuva, which is the third category, she collects her ksuva from the husband or the husband's estate from Ziboris, from the lowest quality. The Mishnah had also told us that whenever you're collecting a debt from heirs, from Yisomim who are minors, you can only collect that debt from Ziboris. It could even be when they're not minors, I'm not sure. But you collect that debt from Ziboris, from only the lowest quality, because we always want to benefit the Yisomim and protect their assets as much as we can. Now, the discussion of the Gemara yesterday was to try and identify the author of the Mishnah. The Gemara had said, you're telling me that an injured party is entitled to collect from Idis, from the highest level quality of real estate. And you're telling me that all of these things are done because of Tikkun Olam, because of some kind of remedy for society. Now, we haven't yet defined yet what the remedy for society is yet. We will in a moment. But the Gemara says remedy for society sounds like a rabbinic law, not a biblical law. But isn't there a biblical law that says that the injured party is entitled to Idis? Why are you invoking Tikkun Olam when it really is Midioraisa? The Gemara had said, you're correct, it is a biblical law, but what we're adding here is that the question is, whose Idis do we look at? Do we look at the finest real estate properties of the damaged party or of the damaging party, of the damager? You know, really, according to, and this is a machlokes, Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva dispute this. When the Torah says that you shall pay the injured party with the highest quality of real estate, whose real estate are you looking at? Let's say, for example, the injured party is not wealthy, and the injuring party is wealthy, and he has very high quality real estate holdings. But the highest quality of real estate holdings of the injured party are really ziboris in comparison to the holdings of the injurer. So therefore the question is, do you pay according to the injured party's standards of Idis and Ziboris, or do you pay according to the standards of the injuring party? So according to Rabbi Yishmael, biblical law states that you pay according to the status or the standard of the injured party. So if, let's say, the injured party's highest quality of real estate is somewhere in Scarborough, right? And the highest quality of real estate of the injuring party is downtown Toronto, so then the injured party is only entitled to be compensated by comparable property that the injured party has in Scarborough. He can't demand, I want a prime piece of real estate in downtown Toronto because that's what you have. He can only demand, according to Rabbi Shmuel, what his standards of idis are, not what the standards of the injuring party are. Rabbi Akiva disputes that. Rabbi Akiva says you go according to the standard of the injurer, not the injured party. And therefore, if the injurer is much wealthier and he has holdings in downtown Toronto, so then the injurer can be forced to pay from his idis, not from the injured party's idis. The Gemara therefore says that our Mishnah goes according to Rabbi Shmuel, that really midioraisa, the injured party is only entitled to get the idis based on his standards, not upon the mazik's standards. However, come along the Chachamim and they say, because of Tikkun Olam, we're going to institute that even though biblical law does not require you to pay this much, we require the injurer to pay based on his standards of idis, not based upon the standards of the nizik.
Tikkun Olam is the thing from the Gemara, but when people start using it in today's day, it's completely different meaning.
Yeah, that's what I started with. Correct. Okay, so now we're up to the fourth line in the Gemara. That was a long introduction. Let's go take a look at the Gemara. My time at the Rabbi Yishmael. What is Rabbi Yishmael's reasoning for arguing that, according to the Torah, you go according to the standards of the nizik, of the injured party, not according to the standards of the mazik, the damaging party? Nemra sadeh lamata v'nemra sadeh lamala. Ma sadeh hamur lamayla denizik, av sadeh hamur lamata denizik. We base it on the pasuk that talks about if a man shall burn his friend's sadeh, then he shall pay with the best of his sadeh. So just like the first time the word sadeh is used, it is referring to the nizik's sadeh. So too, when it says that he shall pay with the best quality of the sadeh, it means the quality of the nizik's sadeh, not the quality of the mazik's sadeh. That's how Rabbi Yishmael looks at the pasuk. He looks at the two words sadeh, says there's a gzeira shava. The Rabbi Akiva, what's Rabbi Akiva's retort to that? Sover meitav sadeh Yerushalayim deheich dekam mishalim. He says, forget about the gzeira shava. You have the simple import of the text is he, meaning the damager, shall pay with the best of his sadeh. So since he's the subject of that phrase, as him paying what? From his best field. So the whole subject is the damager, the mazik, not the nizik. So therefore, that's how Rabbi Akiva reads it. If you read it straight like that. The Rabbi Shmuel, ahani gzeira shava va'ahani kra. Rabbi Shmuel's retort to that is that I'm not completely ignoring the pashut pshat of the pasuk that he shall pay with the best. He the mazik shall pay with the best of his, the mazik's property. I hold of that too, but I also hold of the gzeira shava, and he's going to explain. Ahani gzeira shava l'chida amran. That the gzeira shava helps to tell me that you go according to the standard of idus of the nizik, not the standard of idus of the mazik. However, ahani kra di isle lamazik idis v'ziboris didei lo shav yakidis the nizik the mishalem leimi meitav. Rabbi Shmuel says, when does the Torah say that you use the standard of the mazik to determine idis? Not in a normal case, but in the following case. Let's say the nizik has real estate holdings that are somewhere in between Scarborough and downtown Toronto. He has holdings in Vaughan, okay? And the mazik has holdings in Scarborough and downtown Toronto. So the holdings in Scarborough are not the same The question is, so does the nizik have a right to take his idis, or does he have a right only to take from downtown Toronto, or does he take from the holdings in Scarborough? So that the Torah says no. In that situation, you don't penalize the mazik more than the idis. You don't penalize the nizik to be forced to take the holdings in Scarborough. There you do use the idis of the mazik, because if you were to use the lower property of the mazik, you'd actually be going to a lower quality than the holdings of the nizik. And that's where we say that even though normally he used the standard of the nizik, in this situation where the mazik doesn't have that exact standard, he's only got either higher or lower, you go to the higher standard of the mazik to give him the property in downtown Toronto. That's the way Rabbi Shmuel looks at it. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Lo ba hakasuv el legabos lenizakin min ha'idis, the kal v'chomer lehektish. So now the Gemara says, let's take a look at Rabbi Akiva's shita. Now, for this, we have to go back and look at the language of Rabbi Akiva. When we said that Rabbi Akiva argues with Rabbi Shmuel, and Rabbi Akiva holds that you use the standard of the mazik and not the standard of the nizik, it was really an assumption that we made from the language of Rabbi Akiva, because clearly Rabbi Akiva argues with Rabbi Shmuel in the Brisa. Rabbi Shmuel says you use the standard of the nizik. Rabbi Akiva says no. The pasuk is coming to tell me that the mazik has to pay idis, and he says, and a kal v'chomer, that he has to do the same for hektish. Now, what does that mean? Kal v'chomer, that he has to do so for hektish. My kal v'chomer lehektish. Ilay medenag chei Torah didan leTorah dehektish. Shor re'ehu amar achmana v'lo shor shel hektish. It can't be talking about the following case. What if Ruvain's ox goes ahead and gores an ox of hektish, and now hektish wants to recoup its losses, and Ruvain doesn't have any assets other than real estate? Are you suggesting, says Rabbi, that according to Rabbi Akiva, just like Ruvain has to pay idis when he injures a standard party, he also has to pay idis when he injures hektish property? But that's not true, because we know that the halacha is, the Torah says, re'ehu. It's only when you damage a friend do you have to pay according to the standards of the Torah. But when you damage hektish, the Chachamim say that you don't have to pay anything. If I go ahead and my ox goes ahead and gores hektish, I'm off the hook. I don't have to pay hektish anything according to the Chachamim. So that can't be what Rabbi Akiva is saying. So what's the alternative? Is Rabbi Akiva suggesting that we're not talking about damages, we're talking about a case where a person makes a pledge to hektish? I hereby pledge $1,000 to hektish, and now the treasurer of hektish comes along to collect the debt. And the question is, what property holdings is he entitled to take from the pledger? Is Rabbi Akiva suggesting that he has the right to take from idis? But lo yehei ela balchovu, balchov dino bebeinanis. But that doesn't make any sense, because if our Mishnah has established that any time a debtor owes money to a creditor for a loan, then the law is that he pays with beinanis, why should hektish be any different from any kind of loan where there's a debt incurred and the debtor pays from beinanis? V'chitei meksover Rabbi Akiva balchov shakal beidis kenizakin ikal mifrach. Ma lebal choiv shekain yafe kocho benizakin tomar behektish shekain hura kocho benizakin. Maybe you'll tell me as follows: Rabbi Akiva disagrees with our Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva holds that even with standard debts, a person is entitled to be paid back his debt with idis. And therefore, what Rabbi Akiva is maintaining is a kal v'chomer. Madach, when you pay back a regular loan, you have to pay with idis. So kal v'chomer, when you pay back to hektish, you have to pay back with idis, because hektish is much more important. But the Gemara says, but wait a minute, what about the pircha? What about a flaw in the logic of that kal v'chomer? After all, we know that when it comes to cases of damages, a damager has to pay the damaged party if he damages a regular person, but he doesn't have to pay hektish. So maybe, therefore, you can't make a kal v'chomer when it comes to the laws of idis, when you owe a debt to a regular person, maybe the only reason why the Torah requires you to pay back Iddis is because the Torah has a higher standard when you pay back a normal person than when you pay back Hektish. And we can prove it from the fact that when it comes to damages, you don't pay back Hektish at all. So that's a faulty Kal V'chomer. So the Gemara says, really, this is what Rabbi Akiva means. La'olam denag chei Torah didan l'Torah de Hektish, v'Rabbi Akiva savar la k'Rab Shimon ben Menasya. It really works like this. Rabbi Akiva is talking about a case of damages, where Ruvain's ox gored a Hektish animal and killed the animal, and Rabbi Akiva disagrees with the Chachamim. Rabbi Akiva holds like Rab Shimon ben Menasya that when you damage Hektish property, you do have to pay. The Tanya Rab Shimon ben Menasya Omer, Shor shel Hektish shenogach l'shor shel hedjot, Potter. V'shel hedjot shenogach l'shor shel Hektish bein tamu vein muad mishalim nezek shalim. Rab Shimon ben Menasya says as follows. He says that if a Hektish animal gores your animal, then Hektish doesn't have to pay. That's why the Torah says Rei Ehu, that if it's your friend, if it's the damaging animal is not your friend, then Hektish is off the hook. But if my animal gores Hektish property, then I do have to pay. And by the way, when the Torah excludes, and it only says Rei Ehu, it's telling me as follows. When my ox gores Hektish property, so I have to pay the full value. When my ox gores a regular person's animal, so then it depends, and this is discussed in Bava Kama. Is the animal a first-time gorer, or is the animal a repeat offender gorer? When the animal is a first-time gorer, the Torah says chatzi, v'chitzu es damav, that he only has to pay half of the value of the damage. When it comes to a habitual or repeat offender ox, then you have to pay the full value. But with Hektish, it's different. Reb Shimon ben Asya acknowledges that it's different from a regular case of goring. But it's l'chumra, that by Hektish you have to pay the full value, even if the animal that gored is a first-time gorer. That's the way Rabbi Akiva holds. And therefore, the Kal V'chomer he's making is like this. If an injurer has to pay Iddis for the injury that he causes for when he injures a regular party, then surely when he injures a Hektish, he surely has to pay with Iddis. So the Gemara's question now is like this: I hachi mimai de be'idis denizik kiziboris demasik pligi dilma de kuli alma bedenizik shaiminin v'hacha beplug to the Reb Shimon ben Menasya v'Rabbanan kamiflagi. The Rabbi Akiva savar la Reb Shimon ben Menasya v'Rabbi Yishmael savar la Rabbanan. The Gemara says, well, wait a minute. Now I have a whole question on your assumptions about this brisa. Maybe there is no machlokas between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva as to whose standard you apply to determine what is Iddis. Remember, that's what we were assuming all along, that Rabbi Yishmael says you use the Nizik's property as the standard, and Rabbi Akiva says you use the Mazik's property as the standard. But if you look carefully at Rabbi Akiva's statement, you don't, and which was in yesterday's DAF, you don't see that he explicitly says, I hold you use the Mazik's property as the standard. He just says, I disagree with Rabbi Yishmael, and I hold that that you use Iddis and you apply a Kal V'chomer to Hektish. Maybe the disagreement that he's having with Rabbi Yishmael is not as to whether you use the Nizik's property or the Mazik's property as the standard. Maybe he agrees to Rabbi Yishmael that you always use the Nizik's property as the standard. The machlokus is, however, Rabbi Akiva says that you hold that you only have to pay Iddis when you injure a regular party, but not Hektish. And I, Rabbi Akiva, hold like Reb Shimon ben Menasya, that even when you damage Hektish, you have to pay with Iddis as well. So the Gemara says, but I'll prove to you that that can't be the interpretation, because in Cain, my lo ba hakosov. Because then Rabbi Akiva's statement, what did Rabbi Akiva retort to Rabbi Yishmael? Rabbi Yishmael said, when you pay back Iddis, you use the Nizik's property as the standard of determining what is Iddis. Rabbi Akiva says, no, the pasuk did not come to teach you that, but rather it came to teach you this. That statement, lo ba hakasuv ella, directly implies that Rabbi Akiva is directly disagreeing with that statement of Rabbi Yishmael, which says that you use the Nizik's property as the standard. Rabbi Akiva says, no, that's not what the pasuk is coming to teach, but rather this. So that statement, the way that it's phrased, clearly indicates that Rabbi Akiva is disagreeing with Rabbi Yishmael's statement that you use the Nizik's property as the standard. Va'od, and I'll prove it to you further. My kal v'chomer lahektish. if you're telling me, if you were going to assume for a second that Rabbi Akiva agrees with Rabbi Yishmael, that you use the Nizik's property as the standard, that turns out to be a big kula, a big leniency upon the mazik. Because the mazik now, can you say, well, even though I'm much wealthier than the Nizik, and my property holdings are much qualitatively much greater, I will still pay him with my lowest valued property because that's comparable to the highest valued standards of the Nizik. Well, if that's the case, then what kind of kal v'chomer are you making? You can only make a kal v'chomer if you want to say, if this chumrah is true by a regular party that's injured, then surely it's true when hektish is injured. But now we're saying, if you want to suggest that Rabbi Akiva is agreeing to Rabbi Yishmael's kula to a mazik, how can you say kal v'chomer? If the kula applies to a regular injury, then surely it applies to a hektish injury. That's not a kal v'chomer anymore. Va'od. And now my third argument, says the Gemara. Ha'amar Rav Ashi, Tanya Behedja. Rav Ashi was able to produce a brisa that explicitly states that Rabbi Akiva directly disagrees with Rabbi Yishmael on this very issue of whose standard do you apply, the Niziks or the Maziks? Because it says, Mate, and the brisa as follows: Meitav sadehu, meitav karmo yishalem. That the Torah says that he shall pay with the best quality of his property. So yishalem meitav sadehu shel nizak umeitav karmo shel nizak divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael says that I understand that pasuk to mean that you use the highest quality of property of the nizik. You apply the standard of the nizik and not the standards of the mazik. And Rabbi Akiva omer meitav sadehu shel mazik umeitav karmo shel mazik. And Rabbi Akiva says explicitly in this brisa just the opposite, that you apply the standards of the mazik's property, not the standards of the nizik's property. I'm sorry for 1 second. I apologize. This is a medical emergency. I just have to give my wife a phone number. Okay, let us go weiter. Now, up until now, we've been maintaining that our Mishnah can only go like Rabbi Yishmael, because according to Rabbi Akiva, the law that a mazik pays with idis to the nizik is not a tikkun olam law, which implies that it's midrabanan. It's a deoraisa law. It's from the Torah. Meitav sadeyu. You pay back with the best quality of the mazik's field. It's only according to Rabbi Yishmael, who says it's true you pay back with idis, but you pay back with the idis of the nizik, comes along the chachamim and say that on top of that, we make a takana that you have to use the standards of the mazik to pay back because of tikkun olam. So that's why we assume that our Mishnah went like Rabbi Yishmael and not like Rabbi Akiva. But Ravina says no, this is a different taich. La'olam asnisan Rabbi Akiva hi da'amar mi deoraisa b'damazik shayminan v'Rab Shimon hi dedorish taima dekra u'ma tam ka'amar ma tam hanizakin shamin lahem be'idis mipnei tikkun ha'olam. That according to Rabbi, our Mishnah is going like Rabbi Akiva, and it's going like Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon has a unique shita throughout Shas, where he says that whenever the Torah gives you a mitzvah, you're allowed to extrapolate the reason for that mitzvah and create parameters based on the reason of that mitzvah. Let me give you an example. The Torah says that when you lend money to an almana, to a widow, you may not take as collateral her only set of clothing, because she's not going to have clothes to wear. So Reb Shimon looks at that and says it doesn't apply to all almanas, it only applies to poor almanas who only have one set of clothes. Therefore, according to Reb Shimon, if you lend money to a wealthy almana who has a very big closet of wardrobe, then that halacha does not apply, and you are permitted to take collateral of clothing from her. But the Chachamim, of course, disagree, and they say, no, it's Xeris HaKasav. Whenever you lend money to an almana, the Torah does not differentiate, and therefore you can never take collateral. Here, too, our Mishnah is going according to Reb Shimon. There is a biblical law that when you assess the damage, you assess using the property value of the mazik to determine the standards of idis. But Reb Shimon would say, but let's understand the reason. What is the reason why the Torah says that? because of Tikkun Olam. In other words, Tikkun Olam does not automatically imply that it's a din d'Rabbanan. It could be a din d'Oraisa, but the Torah also is concerned about Tikkun Olam, about remedying society. Detanya Omer Reb Shimon mipnei ma Omru hanizakin shaman lahem beidis mipnei agazlonim o mipnei achamsonim kidei sheyomar adam lama ani goizel v'lama ani chomes lamacher based in Yarden l'nechosai v'not l'nsada na'eshali v'samcha l'masher kasav b'Torah meitav sadeu meitav karmo yishalem. Now, the way that Reb Shimon will look at it is like this. Why does the Torah say that when a mazik pays back, he pays back with his standards of idis? This is to disincentivize criminals. What do we mean by this? The Torah said it because a criminal could think to himself, you know what? I'll steal that guy's property, and the worst that'll happen to me is that I'll have to pay back using his standards of property value. So I won't incur any out-of-pocket loss, any significant loss. The worst that'll happen is I'll just have to give it back, right, if I steal his property, right? But now that we tell you that if you steal that guy's property, you're going to have to pay back from your idis, which means if you have higher quality holdings, you're going to actually incur out-of-pocket loss because you're going to have to forfeit your best property. This will disincentivize a criminal from seizing or stealing someone else's property. And that's what Tikkun Olam means. The Torah wants to make sure that there will be an ample disincentive for people to be criminals. So mipnei ma, and then the brisa continues. Mipnei ma omru bal choiv bebeinanis kidei shelo yire adam lechavero sadenoa v'dira noe v'yomer ekpotz v'alvenu kidei sha'agvenu b'choivi lefichach omru bal choiv bebeinanis. The brisa says next category. Why did the Torah say that when you collect debts on a loan, when you're the creditor and you're collecting debts, you can only collect the beinanis? Why not collect from the idis of the borrower? The answer is because the Torah doesn't want to give too much power to a lender. Because what if a guy has lots of significant real estate holdings, but he's what we say in today's world, he has zero cash flow, and he may therefore stand to be exploited by someone who is really eyeing his property and saying, oh wow, this is a great opportunity to lend this guy money, and then he'll default on the loan and I'll be able to take some of his holdings in downtown Toronto and make a killing. So we want to avoid that. We want to avoid any predator lenders. Right? Even though the Torah does not permit taking interest, but even the idea of sort of stalking someone in order to lend them money so that because you have your eye on his great property, that the Torah doesn't want to do also. And therefore the Torah says that when you lend someone money, don't think you're going to be able to get his highest quality real estate holdings. You're only entitled to his beinanis. So the Gemara then says, Elame'ata yehi b'zi boris. Well then why didn't they institute a law that the creditor can only collect from his lowest quality? Why did they say the middle quality is okay? Because in Kenato Noel Delis Bifnei Lovin. The answer is because we still need to incentivize people to lend money. If we would tell lenders that if you lend money, you'll only get to collect from Ziboris, people would desist from doing the mitzvah of halva, of lending money. So on the one hand, we want to incentivize people to lend money, but we don't want to incentivize them too much so that they would act as predators against people who need a quick loan.
When Reb Shimon is Darish Tam Dekra, is it only when there's enough kamina and halacha, or it's just standard thing? He's Darish Tam Dekra.
It seems, that's a very interesting question. It seems, that Reb Shimon has a philosophical outlook in the Torah that says that you're allowed to be doirish time in dekra. So when there's a halachic nafkamina, you can create that nafkamina. When there's no halachic nafkamina, he would still do that, but it wouldn't necessarily make a nafkamina.
Levush would always give time of the halacha.
Yeah, sure. And the Rambam does that as well. By the way, the Rambam says we paskin like Reb Shimon. Mm-hmm. But that's a whole different discussion. It's the more Nevuchim. Anyway, Ksubas Isha B'Ziboris Divrei Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Meir Omer B'Beinanis. So why then did they say, now we have this machlokes, whether by a woman's ksuva. A woman's ksuva, Rabbi Yehuda says she only collects from Ziboris, from the lowest quality, and Rabbi Meir says, no, she collects from Beinanis. And on this too, Amar Reb Shimon mipnei ma Amar Ksuvas Isha b'Ziboris. Why did the rabbis, when they instituted Ksuva, why did they say that a woman can only collect from Ziboris? Sheyoser mima she'ish rotza lisa, ha'isha rotza linaseh. So I'm not going to do any social commentary on this Gemara today. We don't have time. But the Gemara says that women are more desperate to get married than men, and therefore we're not creating a disincentive for women to get married by promising them only ziboris. They'll want to get married anyway as long as they have some financial reassurance that's sufficient, and therefore this is the best social accommodation for both men and women. So davar acher, I'll give you another explanation. Isha yotza liritzona v'shalo liritzona v'ha'isha ena motzia ela liritzono. And this seems to make no sense. This doesn't seem to be a reason for why a woman can only collect ziboris, but it says that when a woman leaves a marriage, sometimes she leaves willingly and sometimes she leaves against her will, when a man gives her a get or when the man dies. But a man rather, can only has the option of exiting a marriage only when he wants to. In other words, if a man can't be forced to terminate a marriage. So my davar acher. So the Gemara says, what does that mean? That doesn't explain why a woman should only be entitled to ziboris. If anything, it argues why a woman should be accommodated more than a man. So the Gemara says, you're right. This davar acher is not answering the original question as to why a woman only gets ziboris in her ksuva. It's answering a totally different question. V'chi tema ki heichi dichi mafik la ihu takinu la rabbanan ksuva minei ki nafka ihi nami liskinu le rabbanan ksuva mina. The argument is like this. The rabbis made an accommodation for a woman when her husband initiates the divorce, that her consolation prize is that she gets a ksuva. Why didn't they do the same thing for a man? Let's say a woman initiates a divorce. The rabbi should say, well, the man doesn't want to get divorced. The woman's the one who gone to get divorced. So if that's the case, she should have to pay a ksuva to the man as his consolation prize. You want to know the reason why? Toshma isha yotza l'ritzona v'shalo l'ritzona v'ha'ish ena motzi ela l'ritzono efshir damashi lo begita. The answer is because there is an accommodation for a woman that is the ksuva if she's divorced against her will, but a man cannot be divorced against his will. A man always has the option of saying, I refuse to give you the get. And because of that, because he can say, wait, I'm putting the brakes on this divorce, there's no consolation prize even when she initiates the divorce, because it's much harder for her to get divorced than it is. It's much harder for her to force the husband to get divorced than it is for the husband to force his wife to get divorced. Now, ultimately, there are resolutions to a situation where she initiates the divorce. But it's just, there's not every situation is going to end in aguna. The rabbis will put pressure on the person, social pressure, other kinds of pressure, and eventually the divorce will happen. But because the ease with which the husband can divorce his wife is far greater, the rabbis awarded her a ksuva, but they don't award the man a ksuva when she initiates the divorce. Now, ksuvas isha b'ziboris, let's just discuss this issue. We saw up until now that it's a machlokas tanoim as to whether a woman's ksuva is paid with ziboris or with beinanis. So, Amar Marzutra bereder Rav Nachman lo Amran ela miyasmi avol minei didei bebeinanis. The machlokas only exists when a woman is collecting it post-mortem after the husband has died, that there's a machlokas whether she gets it from beinanis or ziboris. But everyone agrees that if the husband is divorcing her and he's still alive, she collects the ksuva from beinanis. So, miyasmi ma'irya ksuvas isha fila kol mili nami. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, you're talking about where she's collecting it from yisayimim? Then of course, that goes without saying. All debts that are collected from Yisomim are collected from Ziboris. Why are you specifying and singling out Ksuva? The Gemara says, "Dahat's not any from Menichsa Yisomim Elamina Ziboris," because our mission itself had said that whenever you collect a debt from Yisomim, you always collect from Ziboris. So why are you singling out Ksuva? Elalav Mine. So what does it mean? We're talking about where she's collecting the Ksuva from the husband himself, and there the Mishnah says that she can only collect from Ziboris. So the Gemara says, no. La'olam miyasmi uksuvas ishatz terichale sal kadaita chamina mishum china ki l'rabbanan gaba kamash malan. No, the Gemara says, really we're talking about a case where she's collecting the debt from Yisomim. Why then does Ksuva need to be singled out to say that she's only entitled to Ziboris? Because I might have thought that even though all other creditors are only entitled to Ziboris from Yisomim, I might have thought that a woman's ksuva is an exception. That since a woman's entitled to baininess when she collects from when the husband is alive, she is also entitled to that as well when she collects from Yisomim. Why? Because the whole issue, this is in conflict with what we said before, we want to incentivize a woman to get married. And we want to incentivize her by promising her that upon termination of the marriage, whether through divorce or death, she'll be able to collect from baininess. And I might have thought that that's the halacha, that even when she collects from Yisomim, she collects from baininess. So Kamash Malan says the Mishnah that even though it's a ksuvas isha, and there's this principle of china where we want to incentivize a woman to marry a man, nevertheless, we only promise her ziboris if she's going to collect it from Yisomim, because we have to protect the interests, the financial interests of the Yisomim. Amar Rava Tashma, but wait a minute, Mar Zutra we still have a problem with what you're saying, because look at the next part of the Brisa. Rabbi Meir Omer Ksuvas Isha V'Beinanis. Rabbi Meir says that I hold that you collect the ksuva from Beinanis, not from Ziboris, not like Rabbi Yehuda had said. So Miman. So who are you collecting it from? Ilema miyasmi lesleila Reb Meir hadid naneni from enichse yisomim elamin haziboris elalav mine michlal derabanan savri biziboris. So the very fact, doesn't Rabbi Meir agree that whenever you collect a debt from Yisomim, you always collect it from Ziboris? And if that's the case, the Rabbanan in the Brisa Rabbi Yehuda, who say that you collected from Beinanis, from Ziboris, must be talking about collecting it from the husband directly, because otherwise how could Reb Meir say that if we're talking about Yisomim, how could he say you collect Beinanis? So we must be talking about where you're collecting it from the husband himself, and the machlokas is when you collect from the husband himself, do you collect it from Beinanis or Ziboris? So clearly the Chachamim hold that even from the husband you collect from Ziboris. So the Gemara says, lo. La'olam miyasmi v'shayni ksuvas isha mishum china. The Gemara says, no. Rabbi Meir Taka holds that when you that machlokas is talking about only when you're collecting from Yisomim. When you're collecting from the husband, you always collect Beinanis. But when you're collecting from Yisomim, says Mar Zutra, there's a machlokas between Reb Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, whether you collect from Ziboris or from Beinanis. According to Rabbi Yehuda, you collect from Ziboris because it's like all debts where you collect from Ziboris from Yisomim. And according to Reb Meir, Taka, we do entertain that argument of china, which is we want to incentivize women to get married, and therefore we will promise them that whenever the marriage terminates, regardless of whether it's through death or through divorce, you will always be able to collect from Beinanis. Amar Abaye Tashma. Let's look at the next brisa, or actually, this is our Mishnah now. Hanizakin shamelahem beidis ubalchov bebeinanis uchsuvas isha beziboris. Our Mishnah lists a category of 3 levels. When you're an injured party, you collect from idis. When you're a creditor, you collect from beinanis. When you're a woman collecting your ksuva, you collect from ziboris. Now, Miman, who are you collecting from? If we're talking about collecting a debt from Yisomim, then why do you only tell me that a woman's ksuva collects from Ziboris? All debts collect from Ziboris if you're collecting from Yisomim, elalav minei. So rather we see that our Mishnah is talking about where you're collecting it from the husband in a case of divorce, and it still says that you get Ziboris. It's a tiyuvta on Mar Zutra, who says that when you collect from the husband, you collect from Beinanis. Amar Ravacha bar Yaakov hacha b'mayaskinan kigon shenasa arev lenizke beno. No, that's not what we're talking about. Really, says Mar Zutra, when you're collecting from the husband directly, you get from Beinanis. When you collect from Yisomim, you get Ziboris. And what is our Mishnah talking about? It's not talking about Yisomim, because otherwise that wouldn't make sense to other cases of debt. Our Mishnah is talking about where a father acts as a guarantor for his son's debts. So in a situation where a father is a guarantor for his son's obligation for damages, the father pays idis. When the father is a guarantor for his son's debts on loans, the father pays beinanis. And when a father is a guarantor on his son's debts to a ksuva, the father pays for his divorcee, for his son's divorcing his wife, he pays from ziboris. And the way it works is like this. Lebal chov beno, so lenizke beno, shenasa orev lenizke beno, lebal chov beno, v'leksuvas kalaso. V'haiki dine, v'haiki dine, and therefore we apply the law to each one. Nizakin ubal chov de mechaim gavu, ihu nami ki magbi ki mechaim magbi, and ksuvas isha de la'achar misa gavu la'achar misa miman gavi miyasmi, ihu nami ki magbi ki la'achar misa magbi. And it's a very ambiguous kind of logic, but let me try and explain the logic as best as I understand it. The reason why a father, when he assumes the legal obligations of his son as a guarantor, when in cases of damage and in cases of loans, normatively, there's a very low likelihood, a very low probability that he's going to act as the guarantor of his son post-mortem, after his son dies, right? Because his son's ox gores, and his son doesn't have money, so the father covers his responsibilities, but the son's still alive. And the same thing, the son borrows money, he has no money to pay back. The father assumes the debt, and the son is still alive. With the payment of a ksuva, there's a very high percentage of time when the payment of the ksuva is because the son has died. Because there's a very high percentage of marriages that terminate not through divorce, but rather through death. And because of that, the father understands when he assumes the responsibility of a guarantor that I will pay your wife's ksuva either because you divorce her or because you die. And because the father has that in mind, knowing that he may have to pay the yisomim, the value of the ksuva, and not just the daughter-in-law. In other words, the father knows that when a woman collects her ksuva, she's many times going to collect it from the yasomim. The father assumes the debts as a yasam. He assumes the debts as the yasam would have to pay. So if my grandchildren's estate is going to be taxed or is going to be collected for my daughter-in-law's ksuva, I'll act as a guarantor for that, only to that level. And that's why the Mishnah says that the father-in-law only has to pay from ziboris. Now the Gemara now says, "V'tepokle da'ariv d'ksuva lo mishtabed." But 1 second, says the Gemara, how can you tell me that our Mishnah is talking about where the father of the husband is the guarantor? We're going to see an opinion in tomorrow's Gemara that there's no such thing as creating a guarantor on a ksuva. The Gemara answer is b'kablan. But there is a certain kind of guarantor that even if you hold that you can't act as a guarantor on a ksuva, this kind of guarantor you can. It's called an arev kablan, where you go ahead and you tangibly take money that you allocate for payment of a debt as a guarantor, you put it in the hands of the creditor, and you say, if your borrower doesn't pay you, or if your debtor does not pay you the money, this will be the payment, right? And you put it in the hands of the creditor, and then you take it back from the creditor. In that situation, even by a ksuva, you can create that kind of level of guarantor. So that's what we're talking about in our Mishnah. So Hanicha lamando amar kablan afal gab lesle nichse leloivim mishtabed shapir el lamando amar yisle mishtabed lesle lo mishtabed ma'ikal meimar. But the Gemara says that only works out according to the opinion that you can create that level of guarantor when the debtor has no assets. That nonetheless a guarantor can still create that level of arev, of guarantee. But there's an opinion in the Gemara that we're going to see later on that a guarantor only acts as such an ironclad guarantor when he feels fairly certain that the debtor is going to take care of the debt himself. Because no one wants to assume that level of risk liability. In other words, why should I act as a guarantor for a debtor who has no assets? So the question is like this: if my son has no assets, and that's why I'm going to have to pay off the ksuva to my daughter-in-law instead of him paying it off himself, how could I assume that role of a guarantor? Because there's a shita that says that no one's going to become an arev kablan in a situation where there are no assets to the debtor. So how can he generate that level of arev? So the Gemara says, one answer is that at the time when the father created the arev responsibility, his son did have holdings, and then they were lost. And that's why he legally created himself as a guarantor. Another answer is that a father, even though normally a person will not act as a guarantor for someone with bad credit or doesn't have any holdings, but a father will act as a guarantor for his son, even though the son has no money. And even though the son has no assets. So that's what we're talking about over here. Our Mishnah could be, argues the Gemara, could be talking about a case where the only time that you pay a woman's ksuba from ziboris is if she's collecting from Yisomim or she's collecting from a guarantor, like the father is a guarantor on the son's ksuva. But like Mar Zutra maintains, but if the woman is collecting directly from the husband and the husband is alive, she collects from Beinanis. And we'll continue this discussion. And Yirtzeh Hashem, have a wonderful day.